Hello and happy Thanksgiving. I'm sorry we didn't get to gather together on Wednesday evening for our Thanksgiving Eve service, but I think that was a good decision to cancel the service given the weather. When Barb called me Wednesday, I said that I would try to record my message so I could share it with you. I've been busy since then, cooking turkey, eating turkey, and watching Ohio State play football and other activities. So I'm just now getting around to recording this for you on Sunday afternoon. And I think this is about the fourth time for me to try this with my setup. So hopefully I'll get this done before the end of Thanksgiving weekend. Let's start with reading the gospel reading for Wednesday evening, and that's from the 17th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. On the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance and lifted up their voices, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. And he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Now he was a Samaritan. When Jesus answered, "Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" And he said to him, "Rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well." Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. This Thanksgiving season, as I look back on 2025, one of the things that I'm very thankful for is that I was able to get a new desk. And something more important than buying a desk, or something more important that buying a desk reminded me of. The week after Easter this year, Marcia and I traveled to Holmes County, the heart of Ohio Amish country, to order a desk which arrived in July. The day it arrived was almost like having Christmas in July. For years, I had been using a small desk that we bought a long time ago that was designed as a computer desk. It had a space on one side to hold an old-fashioned tower computer, a space on the other side for a printer, and a place in the middle that was designed to hold a keyboard. Since we don't have a tower computer and we didn't keep the printer in the desk, those spaces were virtually useless. What I really needed was a desk, a normal desk, with normal drawers and file drawers. I thought that would help me be better organized and more productive. So last spring we decided to buy one, and we started shopping at local furniture stores. However, the only way to buy a regular desk with file drawers was to order one made in Amish country. A relative who is a lot more knowledgeable about Amish furniture told us that we should go up to Amish country to visit the furniture stores up there. I've never been to Amish country, but I have always wanted to go there. I have seen pictures in magazines of Amish farmers working their fields with horses and Amish families traveling in their horse-drawn buggies, and I thought it would be neat to see that. So we booked a motel room and headed to Holmes County on a beautiful spring day after Easter. The next morning, we headed out to visit furniture stores out in the country and scattered among the small towns of Holmes County. As we did, we got to see a lot of the countryside where the Amish folks live, and it turned out to be quite different from what we expected. For one thing, with all of our driving around, we only saw one farmer working his field with horses, even though we were in the middle of planting season. As a matter of fact, Very few of the fields were tilled or fenced in for livestock. The biggest surprise, though, was the mode of transportation used by the Amish. We saw an occasional horse and buggy, but not as many as I expected. What we did see a lot of were Amish people riding e-bikes, and they were everywhere. If you're not familiar with an e-bike, those are the bicycles that have batteries on them and electric motors. And so you can pedal them or use the electric motors. We saw hundreds of those, and I constantly had to be on the lookout for e-bikes as I drove the winding, hilly roads. That was surprising given that Amish people don't have electricity in their homes, or so we thought. So how did they charge their e-bike batteries? Well, many of their homes had large solar panels on their roofs or in their yards, which we found very surprising. We did see one thing that was really neat when we drove down one narrow back road. We had to stop and wait for a procession of dozens of Amish women on the road, all dressed alike. They were followed by families dressed in their Sunday clothes. We asked them what the occasion was, and they told us that there had been a wedding on a hill up the road, and they were walking from there to the reception at someone's house where a big tent was set up. What we found unusual about that was that it happened on a Wednesday morning. Kind of an odd time from our perspective to have a wedding. After that, we were very curious about Amish culture and practices, so we asked someone how we could find out more about that, and they recommended the Beehalt Amish Mennonite Heritage Center. The next morning, that's where we went. There were two parts to the Heritage Center. The first was a guided tour led by a friendly Amish man. He took us to a replica of an Amish one-room school. There he explained that all Amish children attend a school like that within walking distance of their home. They attend until the 8th grades, and all grades meet in the same room. Their teachers are typically teenage girls whose only education was attending one of those one-room schools a few years earlier. Our guide explained that Amish schools get no financial support from the state, and the state lets them educate their children how they see best. Notice that desire for independence from the government. I found that pretty ironic at the time because I'd been following the state budget through the Ohio legislature, and I knew that the Ohio legislature wanted to give over $1 billion to private schools, and none of that would go to the Amish schools because they wanted the government out of their business. From there, our guide took us to a barn where he showed us displays of their transportation, worship practices, and other things unique to the Amish. It was there that we asked our guide about the solar panels on the homes. He explained that they use those to charge their batteries for their small appliances, which they found very useful. When we asked about rules against using electricity, he said that they are allowed to use electricity. They just are not allowed to be on the grid, quote, because that would make them dependent on the outside world. As we walked back to the Heritage Center's main building, we chatted with our guide, and he asked me what I did for a living. I told him that I am retired from working in finance, and I am also a Lutheran preacher for several churches. Our conversation ended as soon as I said that. When we got inside, our guide showed us some displays of clothing as well as books for sale. He emphasized a book called The Martyr's Mirror, which is found in every Amish home. It tells about the history of the Anabaptists and how they were persecuted by the state and church for baptizing adults. As a result of that, many of the early Anabaptists were martyred. The second part of our tour was to see their cyclorama, that is, a circular painting 265 feet long, and it was impressive. We sat on theater seats in the middle that turned as we viewed the sections of the cyclorama around us. I think the painting was primarily based on the book, The Martyr's Mirror. Our guide explained each section of the cyclorama as spotlights highlighted what our guide was explaining. The story started with the creation and told the history of creation with a good emphasis on the birth. The story started with the creation and then told the history of Christianity with a good emphasis on the birth, death, and resurrection of Christ. When we got to the Reformation, there was a depiction of Martin Luther. The guide gave him credit for starting the Reformation, but then he said that Luther fell short because, quote, he just became the head of the state church, unquote. I found that interesting. Luther was never the head of a state church. The cyclorama then depicted the beginning of the Anabaptist movement, which began with a small group of men who decided to baptize each other because they felt like their baptism as infants was inadequate. Those few men started a movement of Anabaptists. And of course, all of the Anabaptists were baptized as adults. Later, the Mennonites and then the Amish grew out of that movement. Those original men were persecuted and some were martyred. As the movement grew, many other Anabaptists were persecuted and martyred. According to the notes from my Reformation history class in seminary, 2,000 Anabaptists were martyred in the 16th century. The cyclorama presentation emphasized that aspect of the Mennonite history. It also explained that the reason for the persecution was because by following adult baptism, the Anabaptists were forming a new church, and the state church would not tolerate another church or people practicing religious rites different from the state church, whether or not that was Roman Catholic, Lutheran, or Calvinist state churches. That's where our guide clammed up when I said I was Lutheran. He saw Lutherans as being part of the state church which drowned, beheaded, and burned Anabaptists at the stake in the 1500s. Although I disagreed with some of the things they said, they were basically right about the state or government only recognizing and tolerating one church. In the end, it was because of that persecution that the Mennonites and the Amish, who spun off from them, sought to separate themselves from the government. The cyclorama also emphasized that the Mennonites and Amish have always been nonviolent, non-resistors, which is true. However, some Anabaptists before them were violent. They even executed people who did not go along with their beliefs. That takes us to the point that relates to Thanksgiving that we often overlook in our modern times. To see that, we need to look at the Reformation and the involvement of state churches. When Martin Luther grew up and became a monk and then a priest, there was only one church in Europe. That was the Roman Catholic Church. So all churches were under the authority of the Pope and the bishops whom he appointed. After the Reformation began, congregations began to leave the Catholic Church and papal authority. Those that left could be divided into two different churches, evangelical or Lutheran churches and Reformed or Calvinist churches. Both of those practiced infant baptism. Of course, you still had the Roman Catholic Church. However, if you moved to a city back then in one of the German states, you would not be able to choose which one of those kinds of churches you would attend. Every city might have multiple congregations, but all of them would have been the same church, either Catholic, Lutheran, or Calvinist, depending on what the prince of that German state decided. In other words, you would be limited to the state church. Everyone who lived in that state was expected to be members of whatever church the prince chose. For example, Bavaria was Catholic, and Saxony, the area where Luther grew up, was Lutheran. From time to time, the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, which included the German states, waged war on the Protestant princes of Germany to try to force them to be Catholic. One of those wars lasted for 30 years and reduced the population of German territories by an estimated 25 to 40%. Many civilians as well as soldiers were killed during that time, and the suffering was terrible. France was not part of the Holy Roman Empire, but they had their own problems. At one time, 10% of their population was Protestant. During the 16th century, one of their kings declared that he was going to, quote, eliminate the Lutheran scum from France, unquote. He died, but later his wife, the new king's mother, ordered that the Protestant leaders should be assassinated, and more than 20,000 Protestants were killed during one holiday weekend. As a result, Protestant congregations in France disappeared. French Protestants either fled to Switzerland or rejoined the Catholic Church, which remained the state church for many years. In England, good old King Henry took over the Catholic Church in his country when the Pope would not grant him a divorce. So the church became the Protestant Church of England with a king as its head. After King Henry died, his daughter Mary became queen, and she restored Catholicism as the state church. When she did that, she killed so many priests and bishops that people called her Bloody Mary. When Mary died, her half-sister Elizabeth became queen, and she turned England back to being Protestant. However, some Englishmen thought that the Church of England had not reformed the church enough. They were called Puritans, and some of them began to break away from the Church of England. So, of course, they were persecuted. Now, after that, the history of England and their religion becomes very complicated and very bloody. During all of that time, the Mennonites, Amish, Puritans, and other groups were outlawed and persecuted. That's why some of them came to America. Even the Lutheran, Calvinists, and Catholics who came to America wanted to avoid the religious wars and violence that they experienced in Europe. However, some of the colonies, like Virginia, still had a state church where taxes were collected to pay the clergy and maintain their church buildings. In Virginia, Baptist ministers were harassed and even jailed. After the Revolutionary War ended, the colonies needed to form an actual nation, so they agreed on something called the Articles of Confederation. However, that was very weak, and there were a lot of problems with that. So the colonies decided to have a convention in 1787 to agree on a constitution. 12 colonies sent delegates who argued for months over the form of government that should be adopted. They have finally agreed on a constitution that defined our current federal government with 3 equal branches, separation of powers, and checks and balances. They signed it in September and sent it to the states to be ratified. There were a lot of people back in the states who did not like it. So that put a real risk of it not being ratified. They especially did not like it because it did not guarantee any individual freedoms, like the freedom of speech, freedom from unjust imprisonment, or the freedom of religion. Their parents and grandparents were from Europe, and they knew what it was like to live in a country with a state church. They knew what it was like to suffer from religious wars and persecution. They knew what it was like to have a prince or king decide if you're going to be Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, or a member of the Church of England. They did not want to have a president or Senate or Supreme Court tell them what church they would belong to or how they would worship. To get the new Constitution ratified by the states, the leaders of the states promised that a Bill of Rights would be passed as soon as the new nation was formed. So when the first Congress went to Washington, Representative James Madison of Virginia, often called the architect of the Constitution, began to write constitutional amendments that guaranteed our rights as citizens of the United States. Those were passed by Congress that first year and sent to the states for ratification. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And it goes on, or of abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So that is where our freedom of religion is guaranteed. That means that no government official can tell us what church we belong to or how we should worship. As a result, the law protects people like the Amish and us from government persecution, and it keeps their nose out of our business. That is something that we can all be very thankful for in this Thanksgiving season. Although I am thankful for my desk, I am even more thankful that I was reminded of the liberties and religious freedoms that we have in our country. We have the freedom to worship God the Father, Jesus Christ, his Son, and the Holy Spirit, who gives us saving faith in the gospel. And now may the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus.